Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Night of the Living Dead 1990. I say that just because recently this movie had been remade. I had actually seen uh, quite a bit of the beginning of the original Night of the Living Dead, and because I had realized that I'm like, dude, like the original Ben guy is really just doing everything, and I mean everything. And we end up having the other girl that he is with just consistently just in shock. She's just like, she's like that through a bulk of the entire movie, to where we end up having her like just a log through a bulk of this film, to where Ben is just scrambling around, like hammering all the doors and stuff like that to fortify them, and to where we really have nothing for the female actress to do within this film. And I was just like, yeah, that seems kind of like a waste. So immediately I just stopped watching it at some point. And so, and that was quite a while ago. But yeah, I just started watching and going into just zombie movies, just thinking and strategically in my mind, thinking like, well, like what movies would I ever have actually watched that were zombie films that I actually were thinking that they were the most like innovative, different movie that I've seen. Because eventually we get this like one-upsmanship going, where we have to come up with the most creative way to kill a zombie in a zombie film. And I kind of want to, as much as humanly possible, try to avoid that kind of stuff. But then also, I want to get the most interesting, fascinating, one of a kind like zombie films. But I also want to also do the like a Zombieland kind of movie, or something along like something that feels different than like every like I don't want to just stroll into every single zombie movie and just like, well, I guess I should just cover this because I guess I should. Um, but I don't know. I guess I'm having that fad of a way of doing things where I'm just like, oh, let's cover vampires, let's cover werewolves, let's cover zombies now. Um, and I know that there's a ton of other zombie movies. But anyways, I love this movie because of its simplicity. I enjoy this movie because we end up seemingly having a closure moment going on in this film, and I enjoy this movie simply because it is a survivor film. It's actually a strategy film. Here's the thing that always bugged me, though, when we have a zombie movie and we end up having people trying to fortify their home, if they ever actually do that. Here's the thing that bugged the crap out of me. So, zombies are dumb, correct? Here is my thing. Shouldn't they have taken the nails and the doors and stuff like that? Shouldn't they have done that on the outside of the house and nailed the the doors to the outside of the windows? Shouldn't that have been a better strategy to cuz then like the zombies are not going to take the door off and then just come walking in. No, they wouldn't be that intelligent, and you would eventually have it to where it's a much better strategy than what tends to happen within this movie. And it just kind of really very much annoyed me through this film when immediately we would have it to where like, hey, these guys took so much time and golly gee willikers, what a waste of time that was, to take that kind of time to think that they could really build up a fortification the way they did, but they kind of did it the wrong way. They kind of did it the wrong way, to be brutally honest. But yeah, so going on into this movie, there is really and truly a purposeful way that they did that, because it's like, it bugged the crap out of me, but when looking at it, I'm like, oh, well, like, that's the perfect way to get an exciting part of this film, to be the whole, like, holding it back moment consistently throughout this film, where you have hands, like, coming in through the windows and so on and so forth. It's much more intriguing. Here was also my thing, though. It seems like the zombies kind of went out of their way to also, like, make it to this house. Like, we end up having it to where consistently you can just see all kinds of zombie like things, to where eventually zombies are going to eventually make their way to these locations. I don't understand why, but I guess eventually, I guess they could sense or smell or some kind of thing to know when a human is near, and I never really could quite understand that. And I wish that there would have been some clarification at some point, but there never was. I also could make the consideration, it's like, well, it's based on noise. When you have maybe a bunch of people all hammering and nailing and all kinds of things, we could have the zombies eventually being attracted by that. Here is also my biggest problem, is you would have it to where, like, so many people are actually and honestly so scared of zombies that they would go out of their way to not even try to kill much of these zombies, which I think happens even in this film. But we also have Barbara that is just kind of mentioning, it's like, well, hey, like, these characters, these zombies, they're moving so slow. We can just, like, really just walk around them. Like, it's not really that bad of a problem. To where I'm like, yeah, like, and that's how you could have easily killed any number of these characters too. Like, any of these characters could have honestly and truly made, when they were kind of going through and uh, like figuring how to fortify this place, why couldn't they have come up with, hey, how about we actually come up with some kind of spear, or like, how about we actually come up with weaponry that is actually going to kill a zombie? Like, I can understand from the movie perspective of, like, well, yeah, that's actually a really strategic, smart idea, but it is kind of dangerous doing a film that way. Where I think now, like, there is a lot of kind of like rubber weaponry and stuff that they can actually do now. Like, if you look at like Walking Deads and all kinds of things, like, you can understand like why they attempted that in those things, to where in these early zombie movies, it's like, well, that would have been the smart move. That actually would have been the strategically best thing to do. But but we also didn't want to hurt any zombies. Like, that's when we have, like, I think the coolest scene is when Tony Todd, Ben, who is just basically just wrestling with these zombies. He is like flinging zombies, tackling them. It's freaking awesome looking how, like, we end up having Tony Todd, who is just like ripping and tearing through these zombies with his bare hands. Not literally ripping and tearing, but you get the gist. He is like basically just beating the crap out of these zombies, and I just thought that that scene was just so fascinating, when eventually he is basically on the run to try to make it back home. And I just thought that scene was really cool. We we end up having a we end up having a time where we are to realize and or figure out that humans will really never actually, in some situations, not help out others. A lot of people are just like, dude, I am out for myself. And like, we can really see the real dissension of humankind within this movie, as well as it just being an overall kind of theme or approach or whatever. Like, we end up having it to where that's why the army of Negans would happen. That's why uh, in the original Dawn of the Dead movie, we end up having a whole gang coming into the mall and so on and so forth. That's why we get so many people then end up going and just shooting a human because it's like, well, they were there and I could do it, and I might as well just kill everyone now because they're all just going to be zombies regardless. So, going into this film, I thought that this movie was really interesting, even though it was a remake. Uh, I have to keep saying that because it's like, well, yeah, like, what could they do to top the original kind of thing? And, like, I don't think the movie disappoints. Like, I think a lot of people could say that there isn't enough going on, or that it's kind of a slow movie, or any number of things. Well, yeah, like, a bulk of the movie is strategy, and everything else is just uh, like dissension between ranks and stuff along those lines. But with that said, I think it's about time to go into spoilers about this movie, talk about it, talk about what things that I actually enjoyed or just got really annoyed with. Because who knows? Yeah, Harry Cooper, that guy, annoying. Boo! Harry Cooper sucks. Boo! Boo on him. Ah, annoying. Boo! Whatever. Of course, there has to be that stick in the mud guy that has to go against everyone. There always has to be that in a zombie movie. It makes for a much more intriguing film or show or whatever. We always end up having that one person that is just like, well, I'm just going to protect me and I don't care what anybody else is doing. I hope they all die. I don't care. They're all a joke. I don't care. So, let's go on to this. So, we begin this film where I think we have, like, this film is really just very odd in the very beginning of this because I'm a little baffled and or confused about why exactly they are approaching this the way they are approaching it. Because we end up having Barbara and Johnny going to a funeral to seemingly mourn the loss of a person of theirs, and the entire time we just have this Johnny guy being such an a-hole. He's really being such an annoying guy to where we end up having it to where the entire time Johnny is just goofing around, acting like he is a monster or a zombie or whatever, kind of getting into the face of people, and eventually that ends up coming back to bite him eventually, anyways, which metaphorically or literally. So, because we end up having these two people at this funeral or at this graveyard, I mean, and we end up having eventually a man approaching Johnny as he is kind of goofing around, acting like he is a zombie or acting like he's a monster, or acting like so. Interestingly enough, we end up having zombie that is going and grabbing onto Johnny, and we end up having Barbara, who it's kind of interesting her like metamorphosis throughout this film, where it seems like she's this very like glasses and nerdy character, to where eventually she ends up turning into this real uh like I would call it like Sigourney Weaver from Aliens transformation, where like she's the nerdy girl, but eventually she ends up becoming this like I'm gonna shoot first and ask questions later kind of girl, uh, which I actually thought was really fascinating because I'm like, okay, this is like the person like you would least expect is going to be eventually the hero in the end, and eventually she ends up becoming that, which I thought was fascinating. Uh, and I don't even know if I even went into spoilers for this. I think I went into spoilers, right? Cue the tape of me going into spoilers, which probably didn't happen, so I apologize. But yeah, so because my life easily becomes a blur. So, spoilers, everybody, if I haven't said so already. So, we go into this movie and we have the hero who is a girl in glasses, which I was like, yeah, like, so she's playing the Clark Kent character right now, but eventually she'll become Superman. It's a weird metaphor for a woman, but it is what it is. So, we end up having uh, we end up having Johnny uh, being grabbed by this zombie, to where eventually we end up having these two tussle, and we end up having both this zombie and Johnny uh, getting Johnny's neck just broken, and we end up seeing both of them just falling over, and I think both of them end up getting both of their necks just broken in the process. So we end up having Barbara scrambling around to eventually see that some of the graves, I guess, are getting uh, certain zombies to come back from the grave. Let's a little bit. So we end up finding out that some of these undead are coming back to life, and they are coming from their graves. That sounds a little bit better. And so we end up having Barbara just kind of like, what is going on in this whole situation? And Barbara ends up being introduced by a guy coming from his grave, who basically his whole entire back side of him, clothing wise, is completely gone. And we end up seeing this guy's cheeks, and we end up also seeing that this guy is starting to slowly but surely lose his clothing, because of course it's like coming off the man, because it's only like one half of him. And so we end up seeing this guy's clothes starting to come off, and we end up seeing this like big huge scar on his chest, as if to, I guess, assume that he had been autopsied or whatever. And so we end up just seeing Barbara going into her car and driving off to like the nearest place of which that she could find, to ask if anybody is in this location. And so we end up having Barbara stumbling upon this home, to where she ends up going in there trying to ask if there's anybody there that could help her. And eventually she ends up knee deep in hillbilly zombies. So we end up having Barbara desperately trying to fight for her life. And we end up having also a character named Ben, who's going to be a very vital role into this movie, coming in here and trying to help her out. We eventually end up having Ben asking Barbara, is this her home? Like, is she familiar with any of these people? and so on and so forth. And Barbara's like, no, I just ended up here. So we eventually have it to where Ben starts to gather all of the hillbilly-ish zombies and uh, kind of takes all their bodies and kind of just shoves them out of the house one by one, to eventually he ends up kind of roaming throughout the entire house trying to clear the house of any kind of zombies. Eventually, he ends up finding a gun along the way because there had been some guy who had lost his hand or lost his arm, and he had shot himself in the head. So we end up having Ben trying to do the best that he can to like kind of make sure that like all the doors are locked and like that reasonably they're going to try to figure out like what would be the best way uh to strategize what is really going on. And so we eventually have it to where we end up having Ben going and trying to eventually start fortifying this house. And eventually we end up finding out that it seems that there are quite a few people in the basement. And eventually we get there to have some people start to come out of the basement, kind of seeing what is going on. So we end up having it to where Ben and Barbara get to meet characters called Harry Cooper and Tom and Judy Rose, and it seems that we end up finding out that Harry makes up the lie that he didn't hear anybody screaming for help or anything along with that. But we end up having Tom coming clean saying like, yeah, like we heard all kinds of screaming coming up here and we just didn't want to do anything because we just hoped that it would just resolve itself. But then we end up having reasonably Tom and Judy Rose realizing that like, well, hey, like if they're actually going to start fortifying this home, how about we just start to help them? And so we end up having uh, Ben uh, and everyone just start to take every single table, door that's on the inside, and any piece of wood that they can find, and cover up every single window that they can find. And so we end up having Harry telling the rest of this group that it is a gigantic mistake for them to try and fortify this home. If anything, reasonably, everyone should come down to the basement because there is no windows there and just hide out there. And Harry gives them one chance to come down there, and they're like, no. Ben immediately is like, no, like, because I do not want to get stuck down there and not be able to come back out. Like, if anything, eventually Ben mentions to Harry that, if anything, the basement should honestly be the very last resort. If they are basically stuck, with nowhere else to go, then go in the basement. And so we end up having eventually Tom, who realizes there are more wood pieces down in the basement, and we end up having Harry sealing off the basement to the rest of the group because he's like, you know what? Like, I gave you guys your one chance. I'm out of here. I'm going to go back into the basement. So we end up having Harry talking to Helen, who is taking care of her sick daughter, Sarah. And so we end up having us realize that Sarah is supposedly having a fever, which I'm immediately like, without even thinking, I'm like, dude, this girl's infected. Like, I don't even know, I don't even need to know that, like, this girl is been bitten, nothing. Immediately when they say the word fever, I'm like, dude, I've seen every single zombie movie now, and every single time they're like, yeah, this person has a fever. I'm like, oh, so she's gonna die and become a zombie? Because I watched the Dawn of the Dead movie, and, like, they end up saying, like, yeah, this fever is really tough to break. And I'm like, oh my god, that's the thing. If someone says fever, then yeah, that means zombie. So immediately, when anybody is ever going to just be sick and have a fever in a movie, I'm immediately just gonna, like, say from here on out, like, yep, they're gonna be a zombie now. It's gonna happen. It's gonna happen to them. So we end up having eventually that uh, Tom hears, or Tom tells Ben, well, hey man, there is much more wood pieces down in the basement. And so we end up having Tom kind of knocking on to Harry's basement to say, "Hey, man, I need, I need those pieces. I need those doors. I need, like, all the things that I could get to fortify this home." And Harry's like, "Dude, I gave you your chance. Like, too late now. Sucks to be you." And so we eventually have Ben with this shotgun that is threatening Harry to just, like, dude, I want those pieces. Open this door now, or I'm going to blow this door open with this shotgun. I'm going to give you the count of three. And you know what? Helen is just like, just give them what they want. Like, if anything, like, yeah, just whatever they want, just give it to them. And we end up having Harry, who keeps calling these people jokers and that they're ignorant and whatever, because we end up having Harry with just this solid plan that he thinks it's going to work, where in this situation you really need to be a team player, or you're going to be the guy that someone is going to want to put a bullet in. In a zombie apocalypse, you need to be a team player, or you're going to die either one way or another, because someone is going to want to seek vengeance on you and kill you because reasons. So we have Harry, who's like, okay. Like, he ends up kind of slowly taking the piece out, opening the door, and Ben is like, dude, you better keep this door open. And Harry's like, dude, I'm not doing nothing. Like, no, like, you had your chance. And so, because Ben is thinking, like, dude, you better keep this door wide open, because eventually we're going to need to come down there, and so you better keep this door open. And it's like, dude, I'd be like, no. Like, I don't have to do, like, dude, you can come a calling, and I will open this door for you. I am not, like, team player, but keeping the door wide open is a stupid move. That is stupid. And I understand Harry just going like, no, like, I'm not going to keep the door open. You're insane. Like, dude, I'll keep it shut, but I ain't going to freaking, no. Other than that, like, sorry. too bad, so sad. So we end up having Tom going upstairs to eventually try and find, we end up having these characters eventually trying to find some resource to be able to figure out what's going on. Eventually, we have Tom who ends up going upstairs to turn on the TV to try and get some kind of information about what the outside world is kind of dealing with and what is happening so that way they can kind of get a heads up. And so while we have the everybody getting the pieces from the basement and fortifying as much as humanly possible, Harry ends up going upstairs to eventually go and get the TV, to where Ben is immediately thinking, oh my god, he is trying to steal this TV so he can bring it downstairs, or he can bring it into the basement and try to get as much as information as humanly possible, and then we won't have any information about what's going on. And so we eventually have Ben and Harry eventually wrestling over this TV, to where eventually it ends up having Harry and Ben almost near the basement, to where eventually the TV ends up going flying, and of course the TV ends up being broken, to where now Ben is angry at Harry because it's like, dude, you killed our one TV, you killed our source, you killed, you ruined this, if anything, we weren't going to let you take that. And Harry was like, dude, are you dumb? Are you ignorant? There was no way that I could have gotten a good TV signal from the basement. If anything, I was just bringing the TV down here so we could be able to all get this information from wherever we are. And so Ben kind of has to let what Harry did kind of slide. And so we eventually have it to where Ben and Tom and everybody does so spectacularly with their fortification of this home. So much so that eventually, once these zombies come a knocking, because we end up having so many windows now being doors, we end up easily having the zombies just pushing through these boarded up windows as if the doors were duct taped on. They end up just going hey, I'm just gonna push through this window, even though it's nailed down. I'm just gonna easily just push through this window and push through this door and almost make my way in. And so we end up having eventually Ben and Tom all scrambling to push back the doors or whatever wood piece that was keeping these windows shut in. They're trying to press these zombies back, to where eventually we end up having several people all just scrambling like chickens with their heads cut off because they don't know what to do. Eventually we end up having Barbara becoming a much more assertive person at this point, and she ends up going and taking one of the rifles or whatever, and she ends up blowing one of the zombies seemingly away. To where eventually we end up having Tom trying to scramble to get this door back against this window, and we end up having Tom desperately asking Harry hey man, could you hand me some nails, help me please. And Harry is just taking his sweet old time. He's hey man, here's some nails, here's a nail, here you go, that one's for you. I'm a team player, bro. What a douchebag. So we end up going along, and so the team ends up deciding that they want to make a run for it. It seems that uh, Helen is kind of desperately asking the group, like, hey, my daughter is really, really sick. Like, I need to figure out some way of getting her to a hospital and or something. Like, we have it to where Helen is desperately clamoring to Harry to just say, dude, we need to figure out a way to get out of here. We need to find some vehicle. Harry, like, how are we going to do this? And Harry's just like, dude, none of the vehicles work. There isn't this, there isn't that. Like, Harry's coming up with every excuse under the sun because Harry thought that this plan of him being down in this basement was just, mwah, like, it was like the most perfect of plans, and Harry did not want his daughter getting sick to ruin his safe bet of avoiding dying from this apocalypse. And it seems that eventually, when crap starts hitting the fan, we end up having Harry still coming up with yet another convenient way to try and survive this apocalypse or this zombie outbreak going on within his home. So, or what is to be his home because he is there. So, we end up deciding to have the characters all run for this truck. We end up having Ben and Tom and Judy all running for this truck to try and get gas in it. Because it seems that coincidentally, Tom's family has a like a little thing of gas, like a gas, little thing to make gas or whichever, coincidentally nearby. And so we end up having them scrambling to get onto this truck, and eventually we end up finding out that Ben ends up falling out of the truck, and we end up having Tom consistently yelling to Judy, hey, Tom is out of the truck! And we end up having Judy saying, like, well, why didn't you tell me? Like, numerous times over and over again, we end up having Judy consistently screaming, like, what did you say? Like, why didn't you tell me? Like, all these lines of which she has to says, or which she has to say, like, as if, like, we end up having to have these characters scream every bit of line out, and I guess to just get these zombies to be closer along, because heaven forbid we actually say anything in quiet tones to not lure more zombies over here. So we eventually have Tom and Judy. We end up having Ben trying to scramble to make his way there to Tom and Judy to see how he can get with them, because we end up having, interestingly enough, Ben, who is just kind of forwarding the zombies away with this torch, and I'm like, dude, that looks so, like, if a spear isn't actually dangerous, they have a torch in this movie. I'm like, man, like, anybody would just burst into flames, and we end up having also Ben, who, with his own hand, like, scuffs out this one flame that he accidentally almost lits, like, the house a little bit, and he ends up just, like, with his hand, like, putting the fire out, which I'm like, dude, did he burn his arm? Did he burn his hand doing that? Is what I was just kind of fascinatingly thinking while this was going on. So we have Ben making his way to Tom and Judy, and so we end up having Tom trying to scramble, and there was a whole thing about them trying to find keys within this movie, and so everybody's searching all over this home for keys, and eventually we end up having Tom, who ends up trying to unlock this gas thing with these keys, and he realizes that the keys don't actually work, and so we end up just having just heavily intelligent Tom saying like, well, hey, how about I just use this gun and just fire off the lock? Yeah, not exactly the best move in the book. We end up having Tom going and shooting this lock, but that shoots the gas tanker, which ends up lighting this not only gas thing up, but also it ends up lighting up this truck and exploding these characters to where Ben is just like, mother. He's like, well, I guess that's all for naught. Well, I'm just gonna make my way back to the home, tackling and tossing all these zombies just all over the place, because I'm just gonna outmuscle them and just punch the crap out of them. Just an amazing moment where we have Ben, who is just flinging these zombies around like they're nothing and making his way back to this home. So we are to eventually have seemingly, we end up finding out that it seems that Sarah, who had been down in the basement very sick for a very long period of time, we end up having her appear upon us. We end up having Helen, who is to go back down to the basement, and we end up finding out that Sarah is getting a little nibble of her mother and ending up killing her own mother. And so we eventually have it to where Sarah is coming from the basement, and we now have it to where Harry is like Andre from Dawn of the Dead 2003, where he is seeing this person as his daughter, not a zombie at this point. And so we end up having Barbara and Ben like holding their guns at Sarah, and Harry's like, "Hey, don't fire at my daughter. Like, she's my daughter. I can't shoot her. I can't kill her." And so we end up having Ben wanting to go and shoot Sarah, and so we end up having this firefight between both Ben and Harry, and both of them end up getting shot. And so we end up having Ben making his way down to the basement, and he ends up fortifying himself there, and we end up having him listen to the radio, and he ends up realizing that the gas key was actually in the basement all along, and he ends up just laughing about it because there's nothing that he could do now, and like it's just like the most disappointing just kind of laughter about everything that is going on, that it's like, well, yeah, God, there's like the entire time uh we have Ben, who is just hearing everything that these radio station people are saying. It's like, well, yeah, like they are definitely really hard to kill, and like, yeah, they're definitely really hard at this, and so on and so forth. And so we end up having Harry, who ends up going into the attic, and he ends up just slipping away by that. We end up having Barbara just saying, well, you know what? I'm just going to make a run for it. And so before Ben ends up going down into the basement, we end up having Barbara saying, like, well, hey, like, do you want to come with me, Ben? And Ben is like, no, I'm too hurt. I can't make it. And so we end up having Barbara just making a run for it, and we end up having those people the way they are. And I think we've kind of covered everyone's either death or where they had ended up. And so we end up having Barbara, who ends up running into some hillbilly guys of sorts. I can't tell if they're actually military or rednecks or whoever the heck that they are. And so we end up, because they're like, they don't actually look like they have like actual military uniforms on. It just looks like they're guys that are just kind of wearing camouflage shirts or pants or whatever. But it looks like they're kind of just like redneck like characters. So we eventually end up having Barbara kind of bump into these guys, and she ends up kind of running into this truck and diving into it because these guys were almost firing on her, not even realizing if she was human or not. And so we have the people realizing that, oh, okay, she's one of us. So we end up having Barbara being brought into the fold, and we end up seeing what humanity is doing as bizarrish fun during this whole time. Like we end up having some drunken guy who is fighting with some zombie as if uh it's some bizarrish like cage fighting like match or something. We end up having or it's some kind of like bizarrish like rodeo or bullfighting like situation. We end up having us kind of seeing a sheriff of sorts or a police like figure of sorts doing some interview, but he doesn't look like the normal guy doing this kind of interview. So we eventually lead up to eventually having Barbara coming back into this home and uh, trying to clean it out, trying to find as many zombies as humanly possible, and firing away upon it. And so we eventually end up having Sarah go through and open up the basement to eventually find out that uh, that Ben had turned into a zombie and is now being shot and falls to the ground dead. And so we end up having Barbara just in such a huge amount of defeat because it's like, oh my god, like Ben, like he did, like he saved me, like he did so much work to keep me alive, and now he's just a zombie and he's dead. And so we end up having Harry popping his head out of the attic and to just come on down and just say, like, Barbara, you're still alive. You made it. Wow. And so we end up having Barbara going and pointing her gun and shooting Harry in the head, and she ends up killing him. And they're like, well, hey, like, what's going on there, Barbara? And she's like, oh yeah, just another body into the fire. Cause yeah, if Harry did not have done all the underhanded things that he had done, uh, this movie would have been a lot better for it. They would have had a TV. They would have been able to uh, have Ben not shoot Harry, and so on and so forth. And really, Ben's death kind of is the whole blame uh, of Harry. And so, like, yeah, justice, I guess. So with that said, that's really just how the movie ends with just these this just kind of tail ending kind of like Barbara just becomes from Clark Kent to Superman, and so really that's just it. That's all of it. So with that said, I think I'm gonna get out of here. Bye everybody. Bye everybody.